As our initial invitation to this gathering stated, PBI spent over 13 years generating and supporting what has become a potentially transformative national movement to establish new American public banks. Over 50 volunteer groups from across the country have emerged during that period of time. And while some of them have closed shop, through over these many years, many others, and today they are over 30. Those people have dug in with remarkable achievements in their locales, from establishing new pro-public bank ordinances in major cities, to the creation of new bank business plans, vetting, selecting, and hiring public bank governance executives and CEOs. We've acquired millions of dollars in appropriations from state and municipal budgets, not PBI, but other efforts around the country. Creating, of course, new alignments with community financial partners, exploration of legal frameworks for bank creation, increasing media awareness, and even the hiring of legislative lobbyists, okay? New Mexico, and we have one that was developing in Maryland. These are just some of the developments that have made public banking a thing in America. And of course, I'm leaving out a lot of details because of the time here. But I also want to give a shout out with thanks and deep appreciation to the tiny, hardworking, loyal staff in PBI's main office, along with our growing, loyal national following who meets with us twice monthly. They are the frontline operators who are making PBI a thing as well. Now, by the way, as I mentioned before, you received an extensive note from ChatGPT this morning, courtesy of our senior advisor, Scott Baker, who's with us tonight. ChatGPT laid out some very clear setups, and it was very, very valuable to see that. Very enjoyable, rather disturbing, but insightful as to what PBI should be doing, but still not enough to cancel tonight's Salon. So it's a good start nonetheless. PBI believes that we're at an inflection point in this work, and that the movement in general, what practical and strategic next steps forward that should we be taking. So, we all know the importance of that succeeding in creating newly chartered public banks is the goal, and we have to, then that's where we're headed. But we also know that the de novo process of bank creation isn't very amenable to public and political capabilities and processes, and that the institutional barriers that that have to be crossed haven't led up their resistance to our goals, nor do we expect them to. So we'll start tonight's inquiry with a general question. Given that our institutional opposition holds so much power across so many key channels for growth, how should the public banking movement reshape and perhaps reorganize itself for new substantive outcomes? What can or should we consider doing organizationally and collaboratively to dramatically expand our effectiveness? Good questions. Looking forward to your responses, but let's start out with some comments from our colleague and PBI co-chair, Ellen Brown. Ellen?
Thanks, Walt. So we were founded in 2011, and at that time, we thought we were on a roll. We immediately got a bill on in California for a state-owned bank. Washington State already had a bill on. They were ahead of PBI being founded. And of course, we had Occupy Wall Street going, so there was a lot of sentiment against Wall Street and for alternatives. But Suzanne has tracked 174 bills and other political actions that we've had in the last 12 years, and we still don't have any new state-owned banks except Bank of America Samoa, and it's on shaky ground because of the FDIC, which has said that if they want FDIC insurance, they need to privatize. We don't, and that's going to be a problem for us getting a Fed master account, although we don't have that in writing, but so we have heard that that's going to be a problem. So anyway, we're up against some barriers. And one problem we've had is that the local banks don't seem to feel they need the help of a public bank. Although in North Dakota, the Bankers Association endorses the Bank of North Dakota, and you know, they have only good things to say about it. It has their back, basically. It acts as a mini Fed for the other banks. They haven't had any problem with bank runs. And the Bank of North Dakota itself is not going to suffer a bank run because virtually all of its depositors come from the state, and the state's not going to run on itself. So it's an excellent model, which, so my feeling is, I've heard from, or I've seen a number of pundits who say that we're heading into another Great Depression, which could hit like in early 2024. So politicians never want to rock the boat when everything's going fine, but when there are problems, that's when they start looking for alternatives. So I see our role is getting information out there. So when they are looking for alternatives, public banking will be right at the top of their, you know, somewhere on the top of their consciousness, like, oh, what about that public banking idea? So I guess that's all I'll say for now, but that's where my hope is that we're actually, as Walt says, at an inflection point, in the sense that the economy is about to tip, if it hasn't already, and they're concealing it. And we need government-owned banks. In the 1930s, it was the postal banks that people ran to after 7,000 private banks collapsed. Because the postal banks were government backed. They weren't going to go bankrupt. They also had better hours and other advantages. You could do your post and your banking in the same building. So we've had a number of situations historically where it was the government that came through with government-owned banks. I just did a presentation in Kansas City, and one objection I got was somebody said, well, that still sounds like government, and I don't trust government. And of course, we don't necessarily trust government, but with the problems that we have, only government is big enough to solve them. So we may not trust the government we have, but we need to take back our government. We need a government that works for the people and that backs our banking system. So that's all I'll say for now. So I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody. It's great to have you here, and it's great to have all these great advisors. It's we have a wealth of information.
Yeah, it really is good. And I'd like to open up the floor now to our advisors to make whatever comments they'd like to offer. I have some notes from a couple of people who couldn't make it tonight, including Richard Wolf, who had some interesting comments to make. But if you'd like to speak, if you'd like to jump in, please just either raise your hand, or I can't see everybody actually, I'll change this view here a little bit. But we would like to start from the floor here. Let me start then by asking Thomas Marois a question. Thomas, I spoke last Friday, and of course, congratulations to him for being at McMaster. But Thomas, when we spoke, one of the future things that we discussed was the importance of creating potentially a curriculum development at the university level that would focus on public banking. And that's just like one of the sectors that PBI, I think, has an opportunity to influence and to help direct, and that is to say, to create some serious academic study about public banking. But Thomas, would you care to share any what your plans and thoughts are about that?
Sure, Walt. My pleasure. I could talk about this all day long.
You got 3 minutes.
So first, before I even say anything, I should recognize that this has been quite a journey that you and Ellen have, I think, brought many of us along on. And back in 2011, we were just really beginning to think about this, and things have progressed quite significantly since then. And there's a lot more people thinking about it, more research, more studies. But unfortunately, and significant progress in the US, but globally, like public banks have moved on to the international agenda. There is now an annual Finance and Commons Summit that is hosting hundreds of public banks from around the world. The last one was in Cartagena. There was over 1,500 people at the conference, including the president of Colombia giving the keynote final speech at the summit. So it's, you know, on the world stage, public banks have come of age, let's say, but they still very much remain a contested entity. And the big debate now is, how are they being pulled between private interests and being used simply to underwrite private investments and private profits, or are they going to be pushed more in the public interest? So there's still a lot to be done. So on that front, you know, as an academic, going to McMaster, the idea is to really create a center for critical research on public banking. And that includes developing new coursework for courses on public banking and financing green and just transitions, on governing public banks, and so on. So those are a couple of things that are on the agenda now that I will be creating, alongside looking to get a number of sort of federal government funding for scholarships and master's, PhD students, and so on, to do long-term directed study. And I think these are the kinds of things that those of us within an institutional setting should be looking to do. But what we talked about, and I'm keen to advance, and I would like, I think would be really useful, is to develop some sort of a open access, curriculum or course, sets of, directed readings on core topics in public banks that could be shared, in different ways. It could be self-directed reading, or we could even do sets of, mini recorded lectures and so on that. To help raise the bar, I guess, in terms of our understanding of the critical issues that public banks face, and sharing those points of evidence that are so important to convincing policymakers, people in Kansas City who say, oh, we can't trust the government. Well, let's talk about forms of governance then that, can shield public banks while working with government at the same time. And all these exist. It's a matter of us, it's time and resources, and we're still short on that.
Yeah, I think, you raise an important part of our vision forward. As at PBI, I feel, and I think it's incumbent on us to open the discussion about what's going to be needed. What we were going to find is that as these banks get chartered, as this process develops, we'll need people to be able to run banks. Public banks. And as we know, the Sparkassen doesn't hire people from commercial banks because it's a totally different environment. It's a totally different thing. So there will be that need for training and for vetting people who are getting into the position of becoming public bank administrators. So I'm delighted that you that you're there and that you're working on that, Thomas. And I also don't want to spill any beans, but we also discussed something I think would be good for us to put into our craw, and that is that we should be having what I think is a curated high-level meeting of the public banking minds from around the country, and including Canada, sometime in the next several months, in the next 6 months, 10 months, whatever, because there is a real challenge to bring this new institutional reality forward. We all know that the barriers are enormous, but there are also some very exciting possibilities, and I want us to get to those too. All right, anybody want to step in now, or shall I just keep going because I have some more things I can do? Go ahead, Ellen, please.
I'd love to hear from Bob Hasegawa, because he's got more experience in trying to bring this bill than anyone else. So I'd love to hear your advice, Bob. And it's great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you, Bob.
Yeah, it's great to see you both too. Sorry, I'm suffering under COVID right now, so I'm just sort of hanging in there. But thank you all for all your sincere efforts of trying to move this game changer forward. I don't want to be a downer because I've been at it for so long. And, I face so many different obstacles, including, I think, racist obstacles to my ability to add a little more credibility to the conversation I'm developing. We've tried to the academic direction, here, you know, the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington, we actually commissioned them to put together a business plan for us. And it was like pulling teeth the entire step of the way. The academic community just didn't seem to have any, they're more interested in maintaining the status quo and elevating their scholarly status nationally, if not globally, rather than, you know, doing really innovative and creative things to train new administrators, as you're saying, for the impending onset of public banking nationally. I think that the political will is where we really should focus on. You know, there are some national leaders that have some credibility in being able to promote. For instance, you know that there's this parallel track with the National Infrastructure Bank, for instance.
Right.
And so we had a meeting with our local congressperson who actually signed up as a co-sponsor on that bill now, Congressman Smith. But maybe a directed political effort to elevate public banking at the national level through that bill might be something to think about, you know, getting some national headliners like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie and others to really come out in force and show their support for public banking. They've been pretty silent on the issue.
Well, Bob, not to interrupt you, but
no, go ahead.
Okay, but AOC, Rashida Tlaib, and I think Jayapal we're all behind the Public Banking Act of 2021 or 22, whatever it was. That's now being retooled. Thomas shared that, you know, that's coming out of Rashida Tlaib's office, and I think that it's important for us to be aware of that, because even though it's a long shot to get it through a Congress, especially the one that we currently have assembled, if you'd call it an assembly, is that the reason that we want, and I think Tim Canova and probably Tom Greco could speak to this too, is that ultimately we want to see a transformation or a morphing inside the Federal Reserve framework that will allow public banks, and or at least the public, to have parity in a banking structure that's incorporated at the federal level. So while that's a long-range goal, I think it's one of the things that we need to talk about and include in our conversation with our followers, if you will, with our own congregation of assembly. I just want to throw in with you, Bob, is that another one of our members who wasn't able to make it tonight, Rohan Grey, has been doing a great job in Oregon. And they just got perilously close to getting a study bill through their legislator. We have a couple of people who were with them, Josh Hall and Madeline, both on our board, who have been working really hard on that legislative track. Now, one of the things that Rohan is suggesting also that we can do developmentally is to focus on legal study of the laws that are involved at the state level that may or may not that may be getting in the way of the public banking agenda. So I agree with you. I think the politics is super important, but I'll let Ellen, please.
Well, I was just going to say, just when I was at the conference over the weekend, Catherine Austin Fitts was there, and she was pushing a Tennessee state bank. Well, it turns out the Constitution of Tennessee says literally that the government cannot have a bank. I mean, it's not the usual thing where they can't lend their credit, which we know how to get around, but it literally says the government cannot own a bank. So that's pretty hard to get around.
And I think the Oregon Constitution basically says the same thing, but I'm sure that we'd have another informed position about what that is actually with us here. So yeah, so there's that sort of stuff all over the place, and people interpreting that they can't have a bank. So yeah. I just want to say, Bob, as far as the politicians are concerned, this is one of the biggest barriers we have is that politicians don't want to get into banking. They are at high risk if they do that. They don't want to be compromise any of their fiduciary responsibility. How do you think what can we do to alleviate that or somehow mitigate that tendency?
If I had the answer to that, we'd have a state
Okay.
bank here in Washington already.
Okay.
Oh, gosh.
All right.
Yeah. I don't want to waste your time with some
Okay.
of that thinking, but I mean, I can relay some of my experiences to help guide your conversation.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say that I think that as we look at what's ahead, that is one of these barriers that absolutely has to be overcome in the process of creating even local banks. You know, I mean, municipal banks, you have a little bit of a better shot at it, but let's take a look at Philadelphia. Philadelphia has a brilliant, active, loyal, hardworking team of citizens who actually had a universal approval of an ordinance that said, okay, we're going to set up this municipal financial authority in lieu of a bank. 15-0 or 15-1 was the vote, and the mayor didn't sign it. The mayor wouldn't proceed with it. That's what happened in Oregon. So stuff like that, which is bound to continue to happen, seems to me to suggest that maybe we're going to have to look for other ways around that. All right, who else? Amara, can I call on you? Because your comment about co-ops, and which very much coincided with Rick Wolf's comments that I'll share later. But I think that might be one of those angles where we get in.
Yeah, sure. Before that, though, I was hoping you can reiterate that last point that you made about the obstacle. I want to make sure I understand it because I think I had a response to that as well, but I wanted to make sure I understood the flag that you were raising.
Well, the flag was about the psychological impairment and resistance on the part of bureaucrats and politicians to not step outside of their provided pathways, risking fiduciary responsibility, going against potential, money support that they've got, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. So just on that point, I mean, I do think that that's still front and center, a major concern. The resistance, to Ellen's point, of the existing banking landscape, even for community banks, I think is still an obstacle in terms of their perception that they are able to fulfill the functions. And I would say that is for the community banks, credit unions, and for CDFIs that have often stepped into that role of being the entity that is the closest to communities and providing sort of workarounds that either entrepreneurs or other folks who have had a harder time engaging with your larger banks, CDFIs have sort of stepped in to fill that role. And so I think part of the challenge is going to be reorienting them around their perceptions of the implications of a public bank in ways that don't upset their sense that, well, we can do that, or we are already filling the gap that needs to be filled. Yeah. So there's some, I would say, both lobbying and organizing that could happen in that regard. And I still see that even in the present. But to the point that I was making in the email, and it's somewhat related, I'm thinking about the ways in which at the local level, and I'm in Chicago, so that's the context that I know best. But the entry point to public banking is through this increased visibility around these solidarity economy interventions that have really taken off over the last 5 years, I would say, and have been continued in this new administration that we have. And the reason why I'm saying that is because there's been a lot of groundwork that was done over many years. And there was always this question around, what does the financial infrastructure look like? What does it need to be? Well, what does the regulatory framework need to be at the state level and the local level? We are a home rule city, so we're able to work around some of the challenges with state level interventions. And then what is the financial infrastructure that's necessary to support these worker-owned cooperatives? We have a more robust community land trust infrastructure that's in place. We had even talked about now with the legalization of marijuana in Illinois, that even has opened up some conversations around public banking, however people feel about it, but it has. It's opened the door significantly to the conversations around the legitimacy, the need for public banking. And so as an entry point, because some of the challenges that we experienced in the past were making a direct pitch to the mayor and through the lens of the treasurer of the city, right? So the treasurer holds all of the information around the city's depositories, X, Y, and Z. And so it always made sense, the mayor and the treasurer, and that's how we made the pitch, and that's who we tried to lobby, when actually the entry points could be around all of the entities that are now involved in these solidarity economy interventions and have gotten a level of stature within the administration to where there's an entire department essentially that's devoted to supporting the development of that infrastructure. And so in that context, it might actually be a much more facilitated way of engaging the conversations around the need for a public bank at the municipal level, because it could support this infrastructure that's gotten a lot of support in recent years. And I think it's a little less intimidating of an entry point for like a mayor or even aldermen who are less educated on the issue, if you will. It's a less intimidating entry point. Also, because in that space, you have folks who are really grassroots, who are doing that work at the community level, and in particular in some of the most disinvested communities in the city, it actually creates avenues for socializing people to public banking in communities where we might not be as engaged, which I think is really important for enhancing visibility, for getting buy-in across the board. So that's just some of the things that I've been thinking about, and Professor Wolf's point really it crystallized it in my mind. And just from what I'm observing for how things are moving, I thought it might be something to offer in this space for a conversation.
Thanks, Amara. That's perfect. I mean, because it also leads to part of our thinking about how do we become more effective in our organizing to get real results. And I think the results that are showing up at the solidarity economies in communities in so many different ways, where there are self-funding resources, where of course CDFIs are more active, but there are a variety of innovative ways in which people are helping each other. And now here's a variation I want to just share with what we're doing in Philadelphia, and actually a variant out of the public bank study in New Jersey. The New Jersey Public Banking and Implementation Board basically wound up with not a bank at the moment, but as a step to get to a bank, and it's a social impact fund. Now I mean, well, it's not formulated yet, and they don't have the guy it is formulated, but they don't have the leader, they don't have the direction of the mission. They got a couple of objectives, investment objectives, but they got $20 million out of the state budget to be able to do something in that regard. So here you see some elements coming together. Now, in the Philadelphia application, Amara, I think we have we've been in conversation working with the Minority Depository Institution, African-American owned bank, happens to belong to a buddy of mine who used to be the head of the banking department in New Jersey. But he is all in favor of being able to collaborate with community interests and use his chartered vehicle, his chartered vessel, to make some of these investments possible. And I think there's another entry point. I think I like that term that you raised, because I think that's really relevant for how we see other possibilities we could think of about this. But in Chicago, I know you've got Woodlawn Association and BIG, and I talked with those people. I think there's a very rich opportunity there for us to do something that will use. You've only got one MDI in Chicago that I'm aware of, But if we incorporate, as my banking friend in Philly says, we could compete for being more effective with our lending if the city's going to step in and provide some capital and maybe some depository and underwriting, then we can really create a program here that the community banks and the credit unions will like. And I think that's one of the obstacles that I think we could defang in the public bank thing, because if we have a strategy that incorporates institutionalized lending, then we become partners with them in what we want to do, and that is to boost credit into these communities. They've all, that haven't been getting it. We all know the gap. You know, the notion that they meet the gap is nonsense. The private banking industry is so far behind what needs to happen. So anyway, so I think that's. Thank you for mentioning that. I think that's a very rich area for as one of the strategic channels we might consider. And I'd like to talk with you about it personally when we have some more time. Yeah, cool.
Absolutely.
Excellent. All right, who else? Hey, Marc, let me ask you. Marc's been our inspiration and mechanic for getting this thing going, and it always when you look at public banking at this stage of your experience, what do you see, and any thoughts about how it's going or what we might ought to reconsider?
Well, sure. Thanks, Walt. It's been good to hear what people have been saying, because there are multiple entry points, and there certainly needs to be an academic lift associated with this, because there's just a lot of rich material, especially overseas. I think I've got a couple comments. One is, if you look at some of the successes that have happened or are ongoing, for instance, AB 857 in California, and now with the National Infrastructure Bank, it's all about telling other people how to do a public bank. So AB 857 was state legislators saying, okay, public banking is now legal in California, and here's how municipalities can do it. And it was already legal in California. It's just they came up with a framework for how to do it at the municipal level. And it was state legislators telling municipalities how to do it, which is fine. I mean, that was a success. That was this low-hanging fruit, take it. With National Infrastructure Bank, you've got a lot of grassroots efforts basically telling the federal legislators that they need to get this bill passed and establish a national infrastructure bank. So again, it's another group of people telling other people that need to do a public bank. We could do that. We continue with those wins at certain states. I mean, certainly the larger states could probably do something like that. And duplicate that success. There is an element to this which I think has been somewhat overlooked, and it's not it could be a major element long term, and that is when you look at the power of a network of public banks. And it's not just network effects. Network effects is where you have increased number of people using a product or service, so it's increasing the value of the product or service. But it's more the association of public banks that created, and there's models of that already. Correspondent banks are in existence, putting foreign exchanges, wholesale banking, and a lot of these types of banks, which are kind of inside baseball type, created with public banks. And you only need a couple of them, but the real thing that you really want to get to with a network of public banks is to have a guarantee from the Federal Reserve so that deposits are insured. Janet Yellen, as we all know, earlier this year said that they will basically insure deposits even though they're not covered by the FDIC with banks that are systemically important to the U.S. economy. So if we make the case that a network of public banks is systemically important to the U.S. economy, then you basically have are making the case to the Federal Reserve to guarantee those deposits. There's state tax revenue types of deposits, but that changes the trend. We're no longer talking about individual de novo banks becoming established, but we're really establishing a new framework for the conversation, which I think can only add to the overall merits of public. That's it.
Thanks, Mark. When you say we're no longer focused on the de novo process, I want to be clear about what you meant by that. I mean, I know what the.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say we're not.
Go ahead.
No, it's only part of the. It's. I'm sorry. Maybe I have a bad connection, but talking about a network of public banks and of establishing that in order to protect public, then establishing a single public bank.
Yeah, and of course, the likely political pressure that would provide for getting insurance through the Fed, perhaps, or at least the Fed cooperation and having some influence on that. Yeah, good. Yeah, that's great, Mark. And I know that's always been one of the things that we talked about right from the start. This distributed network of public banks, the enormous power that could represent. A kind of a de facto or a network that would have some parity with the Fed's private system. Tim Canova, I'm wondering if we could just hear from you a little bit about the Fed. I know that's that's been one of your specialties. Any observations about how you think that institution proceeds? And I'll just say that we've heard some positive things from another colleague here, Bob Hockett, about the architecture of the Federal Reserve with its 12 bank and regionally distributed bank a network. Perhaps a good resource. Is it possible for us, in your mind, to ever have access to it on our terms?
Let me say that I'm finding the conversation interesting. It's seems like what we're concerned about is what I keep hearing is these entry points. Where can public banking become more relevant? What are the entry points in making it so? And just that we're asking the question kind of reflects, I think, the kind of frustrations that many of us have felt over the years that public banking has not gotten more traction. We all see the light, and why won't others see the light? And I think a number, Walt, you've mentioned, and others have too, this idea of capture, cognitive capture, agency capture, not just of the regulators, but of the legislators at the state level in Congress. So what might move the needle? And I guess what I want to at least bring up for some thought is what kind of waters are we about to be heading into over the next several months? There's a lot of concern, I think, and maybe some of you share it, that there could be a full-blown financial crisis that makes 2008 look small. I take it I'm not the only one who's been hearing those kinds of speculations, that the derivative market is ready for a meltdown, that there'll be a banking crisis, in many ways has already started, but in slow motion, and the Fed's in the middle of it all. I just wonder if planning ahead for the worst possible scenario might allow us to catch the wave when it comes in. If there is going to be this kind of a systematic crisis, for the Public Banking Institute to have a pretty comprehensive agenda to hit the ground running when it happens, might be very effective in moving the needle. What would that agenda look like? Some of what I've heard already, I think, is very compelling. A network of public banks, maybe reinvigorating or postal banking. Certainly at the Federal Reserve level, over the last decade, after the last crisis, you saw on the right with the Tea Party movement and Ron Paul, a lot of a lot of talk about ending the Fed. On the left, you even saw with Occupy Wall Street some of the same types of concerns and themes, if not ending the Fed, reforming the Fed. So I do think if a financial crisis were to come full blown, part of the public banking agenda should be a major overhaul of the Federal Reserve, a banning of derivatives. I certainly would not like to see this country go in the direction of central bank digital currency for all kinds of reasons. I don't know if there's any consensus among us here today on that kind of a reform. And unlike in 2008, when the too big to fail banks were not allowed to fail, now we've got these SIFIs. I would say if a bank has earned its failure, it should be allowed to fail or nationalized, the way they did in Iceland and in Sweden during past crises. So anyway, those are my initial thoughts. I'd be very interested to see if others also see the big iceberg looming, that maybe we're about to hit a big derivatives and banking crisis, and if so, if this is an opportunity to get ready for it with an agenda that's ambitious.
Ellen?
Thanks, Tim. I totally agree with all of that. Good push.
And I'd like to hear from Tom. Tom raised his hand. I know that you've got a contextual comment that you'd like to add, Thomas, so please. And thanks, Tim, by the way. Thank you. I'd like to hear more on that. Go ahead.
I was just raising my hand to indicate that I agree with Tim about CBDCs. That, the trend has been toward greater control of all finances with CBDCs. And with the elimination of paper cash money, we're moving toward a situation where there will be a small group that will be able to control everything we do. They could block any expenditure that we want to make that they don't agree with to keep us within our confines. They can even block our total access to our savings, for that matter. So CBDCs is just another step in that direction. But I wanted to step back and take a look at the big picture. There have been a number of different groups and organizations and individuals working on what I broadly characterize as the money problem. And we've followed different strategies and different approaches. My own approach has been to study what it is that money actually is and what money is supposed to do, what its proper function is. And basically, I want to do what banks do, but do it better, more honestly, and in a decentralized fashion. So that's the basis for a number of the prescriptions that I've written about in my various books. But let's take a look at the landscape that we're operating in. This money problem, what's bad has been the continual centralization of power and the continual concentration of wealth. That has really ramped up into high gear over the last decade or so. What's bad in that is that it disempowers individuals, communities, and lower level governments. What I'm seeing on the positive side is we who are working on the money problem, according to our different approaches, we've been educating people about the money problem. So people are becoming more informed. And the circumstances that have been changing with inflation and recurrent depression and problems with the disparities in wealth, these have also caused an increasing awareness amongst the general public. At the same time, we're seeing a gradual breakdown of our institutions and structures. As Catherine Austin Fitts has often said, it may not be a sudden collapse, but it's a slow burn. And that slow burn, I think, is accelerating. It's becoming more and more open flame. And I agree with Ellen that we're probably looking at a major economic depression. And I've always said that the central banks have only two options: inflation or depression. Because the way that money is created on the basis of banks making loans at interest means that the interest must be paid one way or the other. So we've seen the Fed oscillate between easy money and tight money. Lately they've been increasing interest rates to ramp down inflation, and the ultimate result of that, of course, is going to be greater employment and business failures. So that's the situation that we're in. And I think as circumstances change, we're going to have greater opportunities to promote our different agendas.
So Thomas, one of the things you've also written about is about community currencies, and of course the important. And I would say that too is topically something that should be in our future as public banking strategists and thinkers. That as the digital capabilities continue to emerge, the prospect of creating community currencies, whether it's based on municipalities or states, open, I think, a new possibility for this network of community interests, financial interests, that hasn't existed before. And maybe in that kind of an example, we might see a way to obviate reliance on the central control of money and have it more locally based. Does that ring anybody as being heresy for a public bank agenda or inclusion in that? Ellen, did you want to say something, please?
Well, I've had a vision of that public banks could be issuing a local currency. I mean, they would have to be city banks because the state's not allowed to issue its own currency. But a city-owned bank could be a hub of a community currency that was digital, that was backed by, it's producer backed. In other words, you're giving it in exchange for goods and services. You're not just using it for speculative purposes. So basically back to the original colonial system of paper script, or better yet, the Pennsylvania land bank system of printing the money, issuing it, lending it, and it gets paid back with farm produce or whatever. Anyway, it seems to me that arguably you could have a network of community currencies that were issued by public banks in a local community. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, if governments are to get involved in issuing a community currency, it would have to be at the municipal level. And money has to be issued on the basis of real value. That's goods or services. Now, the city, the county, they provide services, and they pay for those through taxes. But they could also provide services by issuing their own currency and then taking that back in terms of tax revenue. But I've tried to sidestep any government involvement because I see all the obstacles that you've run into, and tried to work from the bottom up with local businesses instead of local governments.
Mm-hmm.
But the best examples we have of local businesses issuing their own currencies is with the commercial barter exchanges. They don't really do barter; they actually create currency within their own circles by allocating credit to one another and then circulating that credit within the network. So, I've spoken several times at the IRTA, which is the Trade Association for Commercial Barter Exchanges, and they've had some success in this, and it's been growing, but not at a very rapid rate. And I've written about what they could do to make it scale more rapidly, but they've lagged behind on that. Anyway, I don't want to get into a lot of detail about that, But, I've written a lot about that in my various articles and my last book, The End of Money and the Future of Civilization, which I have now decided to revise and update. And I published something about that today on my website. So,
Well,
yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Thomas. I really appreciate that. And I think that one of the things that we're maybe uncovering in our conversation tonight is the breadth of possibilities and opportunities that public banking may have to fill in the needs that are not being met by the existing banking structure, and of course their patrons as well. So that may be part of the public banking narrative, and I think that what I mentioned in the thing of the narrative arc of public banking needs to, I believe, and I would posit that part of what we should be talking about is not just the democratization of our money, but our commitment to local economic development and networking and community collaborations that have been torn apart by a failure to invest in local communities, by the globalization of our materials and our relationships. I mean, I just think there's a lot there for us to also include in our conversations as we talk about public banking. And now I think we could see that's maybe even more urgent than we may have known. I want to say just, Thomas, again, going back to Rohan Grey, he has a theory, I think it's with Raul Purillo as well, about the digital currency that is not a central bank digital currency, but it is a digital currency that is anonymous and isn't tied into their thing. So, well, I can't give you a reference point for it at the moment. There is one, and I know that probably Madeline or Josh could give us that along the way. All right. Who else? Thomas Hanna. Thomas, I know you didn't raise your hand or anything like that, but I haven't heard from you in a while, and hope you're doing well. Thomas, speaking of local economies, one of his books a couple of years ago, I guess now, focused on the emergence of local economies and their centrality to the future. Any comments, Thomas? And welcome, by the way.
Thanks, Walt. Hey, everybody. Apologies for not being on camera. It's right around dinner and bedtime for the kids. So just juggling things, but it's great to see you all. Yeah, it's been it's been a little bit of a while for me. For all of you who don't know, I switched jobs. I guess it was about a year ago. I left the Democracy Collaborative, where I had been research director for like 7 or 8 years, and I sort of jumped over to the foundation world. And it's been really sort of an eye-opening experience for me in many ways, working at a relatively small nonprofit organization, doing economic development, doing public ownership work. And I think we punch way above our weight, but moving over to the philanthropic world, I've just seen the different scale of resources that are put into different things. I mean, my organization currently is has an entire advocacy team that's working in states all across the country. They have federal lobbyists. They spend probably $20 to $30 million a year on lobbying and advocacy. I mean, it's incredible the amount of resources that they bring into the game. And they're still outgunned by their opponents, the corporate lobbyists who, in any battle, they're bringing even more resources to the game. So it's really sort of opened my eyes to the sort of scale of the problem that we're up against in terms of these points and trying to, get these institutions off the ground. I really appreciated the comments that were made earlier about sort of making connections with the solidarity economy and making connections with other organizations. I think the only way that we really will ever be able to succeed is by building a large coalition and leveraging the resources of multiple groups across sectors. That's the only way we're ever going to match up with the resources that some of these big organizations bring to the table. I've talked with some of you before, and I've talked with people around the world about this idea of trying to build a pro-public movement and sort of connecting with, not only the people working with community land trusts and worker cooperatives and others, but people who are fighting privatization and fighting this this sort of attack and dismantling of the public sector that was mentioned earlier as well. And I've recently been sort of consulting with the Railroad Workers Union they have a public ownership campaign because of the tremendous sort of problems the freight rail sector is facing in the United States. They're sort of insurgent unionists across a number of the different rail unions, that they have a whole campaign around public ownership. I just found out the other day that there's one of the last publicly owned rail lines in the United States, which is owned by the city of Cincinnati, is up on the auction block, is ready to be privatized. They're trying to have $1 billion sale of this railroad line, and there's a huge campaign that's being launched in the city there. Lots of different movement groups, water sector as well. There's all those anti-privatization campaigns there. So I think that, as I said, sort of just broadening the tent of who we talk to, trying to build a movement, trying to get people sort of signed on, explaining how public banking can, sort of benefit all of these different groups, benefit all of these different campaigns as we move forward. So that's just my 2 cents. But again, it's great seeing you all. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. I appreciate that. Would you? I'd like to know the name of your group. If you could send me or just drop me an email so that I can stay in touch, because that is one of the objectives I think we have to incorporate in PBI's planning, is how do we expand our networking and use the existing resources of the democratic resources of people who are in the field acting. I think that's really a key point for our growth. Well, guys, listen, I think that because of the size of our group and because everybody's had a chance to talk, let's invite our non-participating, our staff and board members to join in and to be able to have this floor open and broaden some of this conversation to the extent that that's people would like to do that. For those of you who don't know our board, we've just added Josh Hall and Peter Winslow in Philadelphia, Madeline Merritt up in Portland, Gita Menosha, who's here from Ohio, I guess, right? Suzanne, of course, is on staff, and Scott Baker, who's our Chat GPT connection. That was great, Scott. It was, as they say, it was disturbingly insightful. All right. Any questions from the floor from you guys? All right. Well,
or comments. You said questions, but maybe they have
questions. Comments would be fine. Go ahead.
Okay, there's Josh.
Go ahead, Josh.
So I guess I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say to Thomas that the idea of creating like an open access bank for bank is a terrible word to use right now in this setting, for teaching about public banking, though, it seems really important because, I mean, I've taught in higher ed since 2012, and just having those resources available would be really valuable, not necessarily just within the discipline, but for those of us who teach things like U.S. social history, being able to integrate some of, financial history or more technical aspects of, things we teach. For instance, in my social history classes, I do teach a small bit of banking history in the United States, but it's hard for a lot of people, I think, that come from other academic disciplines to try to add technical nuance to help, spread the message, I guess. So I really liked hearing that that's going on in the background.
Thanks, Josh. And I would just add too that your professor, our colleague Rohan Grey, has an academic study around the legal constraints. I don't know if I mentioned that or not, but yeah, it's work that needs to be done. And by the way, as long as we mentioned Rohan, Madeline has kindly shared a link to his work, Thomas Greco. If you want to see or actually all of you want to read about the digital currency concept that he has developed, I think you'll find that quite interesting. All right. Yeah, Suzanne.
Hi, everyone. Lovely and fascinating conversations. And I think that it's I so appreciate having such different perspectives from all over your from all the country and also your experiences. I really enjoying it. I did want to say that despite all the seeming in a unbreachable walls, it looks like there are some really strong successes right around the corner. And I did want to leave that light on in the dark. I think that Susan in East Bay has managed to raise enough money to hire their own CEO, for instance. And I think that they kind of did it by accident, raising all the money to do this kind of work themselves, but it's turning into a really good and positive outcome. They're not really waiting for appropriations from governments, but have raised the money and are basically standing at the bank with their own money. And then they will, it's the CEO's job to get the bank chartered. It looks like they're on schedule to have it for the end of the year. This is really good news for a small organization. And so let's not put off the idea that put the idea that it's impossible. It looks like it is possible. And I really think, Tim, your idea of like what happens when the derivatives bubble does burst, and I think I raised this in a meeting the other day with us, I think that's a really smart thinking. If we have something that will work, that we can stand up quickly, that we already have those connections, like even if it's just a temporary greenback system type thing, complementary currency system that we already know is going to work, I think if we have that plan, I think we would have a lot of confidence. And even if we, can't stand up a bank that quickly, if we have a system that could at least, an IOU system even, like, because this has happened in other countries and around the world before, what could we do that would recommend, that would work? Anyway, I think that's exciting thing to think about. It gives us a standing to go and discuss these kind of things.
Thanks, Suzanne. I think it's you're illustrating too, I think, a natural aspect of community. That if we were living in a farm community and there was no money, we would find ways to have exchange and currencies, virtual currencies of some sort or another. And I want you guys to make a note of something, because I think you really enjoy this. There is a movie called Bank of Dave. You may have heard about it. The Bank of Dave actually is a series of programs about this guy who was he's from Burnley, UK, made a ton of money with minivans and so forth, drives around he has a couple of really nice cars, but he says, by golly, the banks are crooks. And they're not serving the people at all. And so he says, I'm going to start my own bank. And he runs up against the financial authorities and say, you can't do it. And he says, I'm going to do it anyway. How do the banks make money? Check it out. He's thoroughly charming and funny, but also a very good example of what we're up to in starting our own bank. The Bank of Dave. Peter.
Thanks, Walt. As one of the new kids on the block, I had expected to be a fly on the wall and mostly listen, but you did ask for comments, and you cut right to the essence of the problem. So my answer to your question is that no, I don't think that PBI is headed in the wrong direction at all. I think PBI is headed in the right direction, has been and continues to be headed in the right direction. Of course, where we're going, we don't know exactly where it is or how far it is, what the twists and turns will be. Maybe it's a maze, and maybe it's a maze where they keep moving the walls, as we proceed. So it's not that there is a road to follow that we somehow are strayed from or are not on. I think we are on the path, especially since progress anywhere is progress everywhere for what we're doing. And as I listen to Amara talk, I hear a kindred soul. That Chicago and Philadelphia, I think, are similar in terms of our grit, similar in terms of what we call a strong mayor system, which is really autocracy, dictatorship, tyranny. And so we have a particular kind of political environment which varies around the country. But it, I do agree with a lot that's been said here, and I like to join Josh in saying that an academic program, in addition to the research and the think tank approach, but an academic program of having at a university level the ability to engage students with fresh ideas and have the legitimacy of a course in public banking and everything that entails, which I think would be really exciting, would be extremely helpful in breaking through some of the coalition barriers that we have with legitimacy issue, connection with the academic community. I'm a Wharton finance MBA, and going into the Wharton environment cold is not necessarily the most welcoming environment. So that kind of help would be useful for some of the things that we're doing in Philadelphia. So I'm going to stop there rather than lather on. But thank you so much, and I appreciate the quality and the experience of the people who are in this salon.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's really great to have you on board and to have you on the board, period, at this point. There's a whole story behind Peter's experience in Philadelphia, but I hope that you and Amara, and I intend that this is the kind of thing that PBI is so well suited for, is to create synergies with people who are making things happen in their locales and in their communities. Nichoe, you guys should know, by the way, that Nichoe is one of our long-standing sailors and leaders. Do you still you took your hand down? Did you change your mind?
No, I want to talk. I'm ready to talk.
I'll shut up then.
I was really stricken to the core by Tim Canova's statement about the crash, and I think that probably there's nothing more important that should be on our agenda right now is to develop a plan for if it does happen. The bad will be on us if we don't do it. If we don't come up with it, nobody's going to come up with it for us. And there's going to be a crash at some point anyhow, whether it's in a few months or a year. And planning it after it happens is too chaotic. And I heard a lot of really good ideas today in this meeting that I think could be a piece of that and a piece of our thinking. But I just want to say it's to us, it's our responsibility to do something and to plan for it, not just to talk about it or say it should happen. That it needs to really float to the top, because this is, after all, humanity, and it's why we're in it. And so that's my say. I think that some immediate steps should be taken to really be thinking about the practical things we could be doing, and so that people would know where to look when it starts to happen.
Thanks, Nichoe. I appreciate that. Triggers something in my mind too about this community collaboration development thread, and how important and timely that might be. Thomas.
Thanks, Walt. First I want to thank people saying, they have support for this idea of an academic program. It gives me some energy and some ideas around that. And, particularly the need to think about how that could sort of reach beyond McMaster, but make that more international program. And I have to think creatively how to create some sort of micro credential or something that would give then people legitimacy to say, yeah, we've got some training in that. So it's something to think about. But at the same time, I just want to let's say, I don't know, how to put this gently, not to lose the ambition of why public banks are important and not to undersell the significance of it. And while I agree that we must respect and protect the local and support local solidarity's economy, the reason for building public banks is simply to build an alternative power structure. And if they're not significant and powerful enough to make an impact on the economy and to democratize the economy, then it really is not going to matter, to be honest. And particularly in the case of the United States, the strategy is not to a frontal attack on private finance or private banks, but to build with community alternative capacity structures and processes, both financial and knowledge processes, that will be able to balance the disgusting power that the private banks have. Yeah. And until that happens, everything else is stillborn, to be honest. And so where you see examples around the world where in public banks, and I always say this, are not by nature inherently good or bad, they're only as good as the community makes them to be. Like that's, you know, that they also have to be big enough to matter to the community. And so that's one of the challenges of the public banking movement right now, is that it's quite small scale. And this is the purpose. We really need to bring together the various energies at the city level and state level to think not only about the creation of these institutions within their cities and their states, but how you can amalgamate them into a much more powerful framework. You know, I mean, something like the Sparkhausen or something like the German system, where you're not talking about, you know, a few hundred million or even a couple billion. You're talking about hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars in assets that sit within public institutions that have, if imperfect, some form of democratic accountability, but also clear links to government policy and policy formation. They can't be separate. It would be a fantasy to think that you can, you know, put up a pure firewall between public banks and the government. You have to design accountable, transparent, and democratic processes. So that they're not captured, but that they also become powerful elements of democratic economic planning. And so I guess it's, you know, there are, I think, many different pathways to getting to where we want to go, and not to close off any pathway, but certainly the energy, I think, really has to be pushing towards a much bigger scale intervention. And whether that is through local banks that then become part of a, you know, a gyro system or something, where you have 50 city banks merging together into multi-billion-dollar capacity overseen by large development banks. I mean, that's the only way that you're going to change the system, if you will. That work with credit unions, community development, financial institutions. They always, these have to be brought on board, and you have to work. And we have a lot to learn from these institutions, frankly, about accountability and transparency. But the vision what is particular about the public banking movement, the vision has to be much grander, and it has to be about not directly attacking private finance, but building the structures simply to displace it. Yeah.
Great. That's great, Thomas. That's inspiring and so on purpose, really on track. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to sleep on that. And I think it'll inspire us, frankly, to be playing in the right ball field. Ellen, we've just note that we've just got a few more minutes here, but please go ahead, Ellen.
Sorry, I think I'll pass. I see there are two other hands. It's all right. It wasn't important. Oh, well, I'll just say real quickly, Garl Pervitz didn't make it. He said he was going to come, but he didn't. But I think he was the one, when I was complaining about this being slow, he said, well, you know, it took 30 years to get the suffragettes to get votes for women, which is like half the population. So you would have thought it would have taken less time. Anyway, so I'm sorry if I put sort of a negative slant on this in the beginning, but I do think we're on the right path, and I'm still excited about the whole idea. So great, thank you for all the comments, and all the suggestions. It's been very inspiring.
Thanks. Madeline?
Well, Thomas, yeah, your comments definitely gave me a lot of inspiration and food for thought. I come at this as an advocate and not a financial expert. So I think what you have to say is so important in like holding the vision and on the outreach piece. And then there's this other side where you're educating representatives and working on the nuts and bolts political work, where you most often like need to hold back a little bit in terms of the scale to which it could work, just because when you start, at least in our experience, when you start talking in really grand, large terms, they think that you aren't being realistic. So I think there's this tension point between like the promise of public banking and the nuts and bolts legislation and building power to get us there, to having these institutions. And I think what we're finding is like, how can we have, and we're not even there yet because we're going to create a task force in Oregon first, but how can we keep the framework open enough that we can scale while being able to walk politicians through a process to establish trust and prove that it works. Like for us, we're going to have a set amount of initial capital probably installed in the bank, and we're going to have to prove it before we're given much more access at the state level. So I think it's a really interesting tension point, but like very important for us to have a super high expectation and vision for the transformative power of these institutions.
Thanks, Madeline. That was very much appreciated. Yeah. Suzanne.
Yes, I just recalled what one of the points I was going to make. I read another article Ellen wrote about the book The Great Taking in her most recent article, and Sasha, I forgot her last name, wrote another article similar, but she recounted that she'd already lived through one great taking by whoever collapsed the Soviet Union, and she was in Ukraine, and they had no currency for 2 years, no currency in circulation for 2 years. What did they do? So this is, in our fairly recent history that people currency and all their money disappeared, like all of their money in the bank disappeared. The ruble and any savings that anyone had in ShareBank in the USSR disappeared. And you all probably know a lot more about this than me, but this is a shock. This happened. And so, what can we do if that happens to us? Do we have a plan? And people are going to start to look to us because they know that we're high thinkers and in this space.
I think we're all charged to think of what do we do, and out of our conversation tonight. Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. I think that as people have through the ages found ways to have exchange, but I think one of the aspects that would change the paradigm of money, moving it from a commodity into a relational utility, where we see that money really belongs to an exchange between communities and people and individuals, where it's taken out of this thingness and brought into, give it a little heart and connection. That's where a lot of transformative energy can occur. That's where the human spirit and the human relationship and power can really be realized. So maybe it would be a good thing for this corrupt system to collapse. I think people will find their way forward, and certainly the public banking would be on track to help maybe guide that. Guys, we do have a couple more minutes, I suppose, but I just wanted to thank you for coming. Also wanted to invite you to consider, we are going into what I've been calling PBI 2.0, a new generation, a new era of our work, building on the work that we've done, but branching out and making a bigger impact as we can, as best we can. It involves all kinds of these dimensions that we were talking about, from networking with existing community people to building the academic wherewithal and understanding to the legal, et cetera, et cetera. As Thomas said, we need to be a lot bigger, not just organizationally, but as a movement. And we know that there are people around the country who are working in the same channels that we are, who want to join us. So that's one of the things PBI is going to be up to, is finding those people, creating these meaningful networks, but also, I hope, in the near future, to be able to create some real on-the-ground development of modeling of how communities can invest in each other and how we can create this banking power that we all know we desperately need.
Walt?
Yes, please.
I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand. I'm sorry.
No.
So I just wonder if maybe a listserv for all of us to communicate about these ideas might be a good idea moving forward, so that there's more continual discussion of some of these ideas, and maybe that'll help move some of these forward in a practical way.
That's a great idea, Timothy, and I think that we'll put that in motion. Okay, I mean this board of advisors is an extraordinarily fine group of folks. We have many people who were not able to make it tonight, but the conversation is great, and we need to do more of it. So that would be a great idea. Thanks. We'll do that. Listen, keep PBI in mind when it comes time for you to do your year-end donations, will you please? We scratch the bottom of the barrel for money. We're going to change that too, but would love to have your financial partnership with what we're all up to, and most especially value your input and your participation. It really makes what we do worthwhile. So thank you. Anyone else before we close off?
Walt, I was just going to ask, well, I'd asked if you can drop the link, the donation link here, but perhaps sending it in the follow-up email would be good, so that we don't forget as the end of the year fast approaches. We can contribute now.
Thanks very much, Amara. We absolutely will. All right, guys. Well, with that said, it's 8:30. An old radio guy. It means it's network timing. Good night. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk soon.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Great to see you all.